Steph Curry is a basketball savant, winning multiple championships over the course of a decade and doing it all in record-breaking fashion. He is also quite an accomplished golfer. Some have argued that if he quit basketball and focused 100% of his energy to golf, he could possibly make the tour. Today, we are going to delve into his golf swing and uncover some moves that will prevent him from making this jump if he chose to make it. If you find any part of this video interesting or you learned something from it, help support us by liking, commenting, or even consider subscribing, as this channel's purpose is to help teach about golf swing's cause and effect. We also raise money through this channel to donate it to the Heal the Hood Foundation in South Africa for low-income children and help introduce them to golf. Enough of the chit-chat. Get ready to uncover the cause and effect of the great Steph Curry. Good afternoon, Land Golf Academy members. I guess we have the great Steph Curry on screen. What we're going to look at is a couple of cause and effects that I see that do limit his motions, that are potential power leaks, and it's mainly due to his setup and also his first initial takeaway motion around that setup. But because he's such a gifted athlete, this man is able to compensate at a higher production level than the average person can. Being a taller man, I assume he does have correctly fitted clubs, so we're just going to go on that assumption that he's already fitted. And I scoured the internet. I could not find a face-on with the driver. I found this face-on with a wedge and also this down the line with the driver, but we're going to look at cause and effect on both of these swing motions and how they play in part with each other. So let's get started. Left side of the screen, what we can see here is initially set up. We can see most of his body weight seems to be slightly ahead of that golf ball. Now if we go ahead and connect his shoulders together and draw that straight line straight from his spine down through his hands, you can see that things are somewhat in line with each other. Now I know that this isn't directly face on, so it could be a camera illusion, so we're just going to assume based on the setup that things are correctly aligned. What I want you to look at is I'm going to draw a little X by that logo on his hat, because that's going to play a big part in his swing, and his motion relies heavily on his weight distribution, and his head is actually his anchor point in his swing. If I was working with him, one of the first things I would change is shifting his left hip towards his target slightly, just to keep his hip tilt in line with his shoulder tilt, and plus get his weight more evenly distributed, because we can see a majority of the weight on the right side here. Now right side of the screen here, what we're going to look at is his setup and how these lines play an important role. If we look at from his arches of his feet and draw a straight line up, we can see it comes pretty close to that cross point between his lower plane line and his spine angle line. I prefer to keep things in line with each other if that's possible, if your body can do it. Now this comes into play is he playing the correct equipment? Is that club too short? Does he have to lengthen that club? We can see a majority of his weighting is over his toes. If we see how much of that body weight is behind that line versus in front, obviously we're going to have more in front, but we're looking in terms of the knees. So we see the knee flexion pushing that weight over to the toes, and this plays a little bit of a role in his motion, specifically with his driver. So let's go with midway point. We're going to take that club back to about midway, right about there, and the same thing with the right side of the screen. So what we can see here now is we see the tilting occurring, but we don't see those hands in line with the tilt, so the hands are pulling back a little bit prematurely. Now on the right side of the screen, we can also assume that's occurring because that right elbow is pulling back down, and if he were truly connected, the right arm would be a little bit straighter. We can see a little bit of evidence in this because that shoulder turn is already starting to flatten out, because once you pick up your hands and roll that club face open, it alleviates the pressure on his left side and he starts to lose his posture in terms of his shoulder tilt. Hands have deviated up away from that lower plane line, and this is another sign that things are moving more around instead of holding your tilt. Now we are actually going to redraw that X because this person videoing this actually moved the camera slightly on that motion, but from here on out it stays pretty steady. So let's go even further back. We're going to go to about arms parallel to the ground, and what we can see here is his tilting of his hips is going to push his spine angle slightly ahead of that target. Now this is an issue because once you get that weighting to the outside of this right hip, it should be storing on the inside of his right foot. Once the weighting starts shifting out, he's actually going to start to store his weight on the outside of his right foot, and this plays a bit of a problem with how he transitions into the target. He's an athlete, so he can get away with it, but because he's an athlete, he should be taking advantage of the ground forces that he can create. But we'll get into that once we start to see that transition occur. Right side of the screen, let's get those arms to parallel. So there's about parallel. We can see the arms are trying to race to that secondary plane line. We see the shoulder tilting, still flattening out. We start to see the head start moving its posture out of the box here. And that is a sign that his weighting is starting to tip more to his toes. Back to the left side of the screen, we're going to keep going back to the top of the swing right when the transition occurs, and we can see that little bump here. What we can learn from this is let's redraw those hips now. Let's connect the hips, and then also the spine typically works on 90 degrees where those hips are. So now he's got a forward leaning spine. Now I know you want to have a slightly forward leaning spine if you want to try and hit down in the golf ball, which is what we're trying to do with an iron, but we can see that right hip jutting out, and we can see the weighting is now stuck on that right side of the foot. It should be again on the inside of the foot, so now you have something to push off on. But if it's on the right side of the foot, it's going to be more of a roll down to impact. So he is going to have to counteract that in some ways. Now if we take a look at where his hands are in relation to his chest, so we draw out here, you can see it's slightly moved further back off of his right shoulder. However, it is still out in front of his body, so in terms of his arm position, it's okay. Let's go to the right side of the screen. When we get to the top position, we can see that head kind of dipping more forward. He's coming slightly out of that box, and what we can see as a result is not much more tilting that's occurring, but his whole weighting has shifted towards the golf ball. Now when you are trying to swing up on the ball with a driver, you want to stay against your back brace line, which is that small little purple line, and that will allow you to just drop the club naturally while you turn. But because he is starting to shift forward, he has to compensate somehow. But remember, the downswing happens in a third of the time, so there's very little time to make your readjustments unless you are gifted like this man is with hand-eye coordination. And we all know he has phenomenal hand-eye coordination. In terms of where that club, where the butt of the club is, you can see it is just kind of shifted ahead of where it should have been based on his weighting, and we can start to look at the relationship between the shoulders. So if we back it up a little bit and go back to the top again, so that's where his shoulder tilt is at the top of the swing, which is that small little green line. Now in relation to his current spine angle, we can see that that small little green line is laid off compared to his spine angle. It should be directly perpendicular to that. So now if we recalibrate where his arms should be, let's take a look here. So if we do a 90 degrees based on that current spine angle, that's where his hands should be. That's where the top of his hands should be, is where that X is. So in relation to his spine angle, you can see his arms are still fairly low where they need to be. Now the arms are lower relative to his new green spine angle because his body is feeling the weight storing up in the toes, and this is his attempt to compensate that by pulling some of that weighting back to the heels. And this leaves him with some hand manipulation to try and get that club back to center. So we will actually see this motion here at the end of his swing, and we'll see that the hands and arms still play some sort of catch up from disassociation. So let's watch that logo at the top of his backswing. Now he's going to try and move his weight distribution from the right side to the left side. Now keep in mind that he has loaded this weight up on the outside of his right foot, and he's trying to get it to the left side, so he can't really push off. When you push off, usually that tilts your hips, that takes care of your knees, you drop your shoulder, and then you release down based on the center of your position. Now because he's trying to get the weighting over, we can see what happens to that logo. It falls ahead because he's leaning left, and while he's leaning left, his hips are actually going to start to rock underneath. So we see the hips rocking back underneath, and as a result now, watch that logo, he falls back. So we see a lot of this leaning left and then rocking under to square himself up. So this tiny little motion here, if you time it well, which he can obviously, it's pretty good. But in order to go from this level to a PGA Tour level, you can't have this timing over and over again unless you can afford hitting thousands of golf balls. Now let's take a look at that same motion on the right side of the screen. So now we know we're dealing with a little bit of an increased tilt with the upper body, and we have to compensate that. So the first move that he will do is I've drawn a little X where his top of his hands are. So the first thing he's got to figure out, or his body's got to feel, is how do I get that club from it crossing the line to down in the plane? And we can tell he turns because if you look at the path of his hands, you can see a slight drop first, right? So the club goes down and then he starts to turn. So if you draw an X where the club is down, we're going to connect the X's and see that's all a downward motion. Now if you take a look at those hands go straight this way. Now that is an indication of turn. Now as a result, we can see him starting to lose a little bit more of that posture. Now he's pushed back closer to where that initial spine angle was, and he's going to drop that club. Now the problem with this is the club in that momentum will want to fall below this plane, and we can see how it falls below the plane. I know it's blurry, but it's there, and the hands are up. Now the hands are up because the weighting is stuck on the toes, so we don't see much driving going on. We just see kind of a spinning motion going on, and there's no lower body activity other than spinning. Now, when that happens, you start to stand up out of your posture, but for him, he needed to stand up out of his posture because he was slightly forward. So this is a compensatory move to get him back to where he should have been. From that position, though, it's going to be hard to time this because when the club gets below that plane line, there's going to be active hands and overactive hands. So sometimes you might block it, sometimes you might pull it. This is another move that will prevent him from going that next level until they can sort out this out. And it's not necessarily a move you can focus on directly. You have to look at what the cause was. So the cause is basically your setup. And that first couple of feet away in the takeaway, the shoulders aren't opening up, they're driving under, keeping his hands ahead. As he comes on through, we're going to look at the shoulder tilt here, and it's relatively close to his initial spine angle setup. Now the exit path of his hands will match that. So all in all, he recovers very well, and we see that at the end, which is what I'm talking about. Those hands, when you see this at the end where the hands are kind of overactive, that means that they were overactive on the back and they had to play catch up. It's too much hand activity for my liking. Left side of the screen, we see those hands coming over to save that motion. So look at the club. If we draw a straight line through the club, this shows me that at least he's able to keep his hands in relation to his chest. However, his hand action in terms of releasing the club is a little bit too overactive. Now, when you have overactive hands, once again, that means something is not right in the connection between the hands and the chest. Even past impact, you see that left heel coming off the ground, the right heel coming off the ground. So again, he's very toe oriented when he comes through. He doesn't quite have the weighting on the left side, borderline spinning out past impact, and we see the upper body is still leaning slightly forward of the lower body. So this is a little bit stack and tilty. However, it's a little bit failed stack and tilt, because to be stack and tilt, you have to be heavily favoring your left side throughout the entire swing, where he doesn't. He gets that tilt going, but his weighting is too far on the right side to make this work. So it's just compensatory motions. Now, he makes it work because he has an incredible athlete, probably one of the best shooters of all time in basketball. And to have that, you need great footwork, great center of balance, great hand-eye coordination, and he clearly displays it here in golf. He's the top 1%er in golf. Now, to take him to the next level, he's going to need to work on a couple things here. So make sure you're working with somebody, make sure they're PGA, LPGA qualified, and that they do body analysis tests on you. I hope that helps you. Don't forget, tomorrow we start our 3-month series on working with 4 amateurs and trying to see if we can take them from point A to point B. So look out for that introductory video tomorrow. Other than that, I'll see you next time. Fairways and greens.